Howdy, folks, and welcome to Black Hat Bitcoin, the newsletter and video newsletter for people who don't care about Bitcoin, but are interested in learning just a little bit more, understanding some of the basics, why this is such an important innovation in financial technology. So before we jump into today's video newsletter, I would love for you to go check out blackhatbitcoin.substack.com, where you can subscribe to the email newsletter. I basically just have in writing the sort of thing that I'm sharing here today, but it's a good way for me to be able to communicate other things as well. If there are interesting articles or topics that come up that I can share that might make your life easier as it pertains to understanding the wild, wild world of Bitcoin. So let's jump right in here. For today's newsletter, we're talking about Bitcoin's unique properties, and this is part 2. Alrighty, so in part 1 of this little mini newsletter series, we talked about some of the economic properties of Bitcoin that make it distinct from fiat currency. So what we know is, government national currencies that can effectively be printed at will. We talked about things like scarcity and decentralization and some of these things that make it economically more viable and tamper-proof, resistant to some of the economic challenges that fiat currencies today face. Today, we're talking about 4 properties that are more social and political advantages that Bitcoin has. And, some of these, if you're living in the West, as I am, there are going to be things that you look at and you say, well, that doesn't matter to me. It doesn't apply to me. Who cares? I'm not worried about some of these things. But you have to remember that there are north of 1 billion people, probably several billion people around the world who don't have unbelievable access to financial services. They are censored in certain ways for their political, religious, or other affiliations. And so this impacts a great number of people. And it doesn't really matter if you think it matters today. What matters is this going to be the global currency that wins out in the free market because of all of these advantages in aggregate? So let's jump in right here and we'll talk about 4 of the social and political advantages that Bitcoin possesses. Okay, number 1, Bitcoin is permissionless. So what do we mean by permissionless? It means nobody has to give you permission to use Bitcoin. So if you want to really transact in any meaningful way with the global economy or even just the economy within your own country, you pretty much need access to traditional financial services, banks and lending institutions, and all of these things that most of us take for granted. The reality is that you can be denied access to a bank account. You can have assets sanctioned. There are a host of ways that you can effectively be cut off and shut out from the ability to transact in any sort of normal way in your daily life. Bitcoin, on the other hand, requires a smartphone or a web browser and access to the internet, and that's it. Anyone can sign in. I can't stop you. No one can stop you. No government authority can stop you as long as you have access to some sort of a hardware wallet or a software wallet in the form of a web browser or a smartphone app, and access to connect to the internet, which today is pretty easy for most people to do, even in developing countries, and is becoming increasingly easier with things like Starlink and satellite-based internet communication tools. So it's permissionless. You can't be shut out. Again, today that might not matter to you, but it matters to someone. It matters to a lot of people around the world already. The second attribute we're talking about today is that Bitcoin is peer-to-peer. So much like it is permissionless in that you don't need someone's permission to engage it the way you would the traditional financial system. You also don't need to use the traditional financial system to interface with it. So it's not just about permission, but also how you interact. So if you wanted to send an ACH or a wire transfer, for example, anything really but cash, which has its own security flaws and issues, it requires 2, 3, 4, many financial institutions, clearinghouses, and remittance providers and banks. And if I want to get cash from my home in St. Louis to Tokyo to Japan, there's not really any way to do that in the traditional system that doesn't involve a lot of people. So there's counterparty risk, there are fees associated with that, and so forth. With Bitcoin, I can send nearly instantaneously as much value in the form of Bitcoin as I'd like around the world. It, on the base layer of Bitcoin, it may take 10 minutes. It could take up to an hour. It's very quick relative to, for example, waiting, for a wire or for an ACH to go through. The fees are incredibly low. I mean, fractions of a penny, generally speaking. And then there's a new layer that we're not going to get into here, but called the Lightning Network that sort of sits on top of Bitcoin that enables instantaneous movement of Bitcoin across various channels. And so it's direct, peer to peer. I send you money, you send me money, Bitcoin being the money. And that is an incredibly powerful tool because we don't have to wait, we don't have to rely on anyone else, and we don't have to pay a fortune just to engage in simple commercial transactions. Number 3, Bitcoin is censorship resistant. So you might remember in early 2022, there was a Canadian truckers protest. They were protesting what they felt to be egregious governmental overreach related to COVID vaccine requirements, effectively. And what happened was it went on, and it was obviously impacting the Canadian economy. And the Canadian government basically said, "Okay, enough is enough. We're going to freeze the assets of those involved in the protests, even financial supporters and sympathizers." And so they basically cut these people off from the monetary system to which they had previously received permission. So it wasn't that they were not given permission initially, but because of a lawful protest in which they were participating, they were censored. With Bitcoin, you can't censor that sort of thing. If I want to send money, I can send money. I can send it across the Lightning Network. I can send Bitcoin directly on the base layer. I can have my own wallet. You have your own wallet. We can transact, and there's no one in the middle to stop us. Now, today, as Bitcoin adoption continues to grow, there's still the challenge of taking that and getting fiat currency out of it. So if I have Bitcoin and I've been in some way censored, I may not be able to, get dollars with that Bitcoin easily. But there are already countries, there are places where you can go to address those sorts of issues. And of course, if you know someone who isn't censored, maybe they can assist you as well. So the options are available, but you can't censor Bitcoin the way that you can censor this highly centralized traditional fiat monetary system in which we live today. And last but not least, number 4, Bitcoin is portable. So imagine you're a refugee. So you're in Lebanon and your currency is hyperinflated because this happened recently. So, you had $500,000, or I can't remember what the Lebanese currency was in the bank, $500,000, and suddenly that $500,000 is worth, $20,000, and it's sitting in the bank. And oh, by the way, they're not letting you remove that from the bank. Okay. You need to get out of Lebanon. You need to go find a place where you can continue to live because it's going to get dangerous, civil unrest. There's all sorts of things that come with hyperinflation or with any number of social sort of challenges and circumstances. What's the best way to get value out of the country? So you could take your local currency with you to the extent that you could get it, but it's not worth anything. You're not going to be able to trade that for much to get euros or dollars or anything like that because it's the value's been inflated away. You can't take your house with you, which is where a lot of people store much of their wealth. You could take gold or silver, but the problem is to have any meaningful amount of that means you needed to probably plan in advance, and you weren't able to, you weren't using your fiat currency to the extent that maybe you would have liked. It's heavy to carry. And what are the odds that at a border crossing, you're going to just be able to waltz on through without some of that or all of that perhaps being confiscated? Probably pretty low. With Bitcoin, you could memorize or write down on a piece of paper that you could hide a 12-word seed phrase that you can punch into a hardware wallet when you get across the border to safety, wherever you're going, and you instantaneously have access to your Bitcoin once again. So it's an incredible way to not only store value into the future, but also to move value across space for any number of reasons. So keep in mind, again, you might not need or feel compelled to do anything like that today, but there are tens of thousands, perhaps millions of people around the world today who are displaced, who are economic refugees, who are political exiles, whatever the case may be, and they need a way to move value around to get from where they are to where they need to be for safety purposes or whatever their reasons. And that's something that's very easy to take for granted when it's not your life or situation, but it impacts so many people today. Alrighty, so quick recap. So we talked last time about some of the economic distinctions of Bitcoin and why it's so much better than a typical fiat currency. Today we talked more about what I'm just sort of coining as the social and political advantages to Bitcoin. It's permissionless. You don't need to ask someone's permission. There's no one to grant you permission to join and engage with the Bitcoin network. It's peer to peer, so there's no counterparty risk. There are no third parties to, besides the miners, to charge you relatively minimal fees. And it's a free market. So they've got to fight and compete to keep those fees low for everyone. Censorship resistant. So your religious, political, any other affiliation that you might have that could be unpopular in a particular jurisdiction, you can't be censored for that. There's no way for them to stop you from transacting. And then finally, Bitcoin is portable. So if you are forced to move or leave or in any way, cross the globe, you're able to take a handful of words. You can store it in your head. You can store it on a piece of paper. If the means by which you're getting to your destination are relatively safe, you can take a hardware wallet with you, and you can take your Bitcoin in a way that you couldn't take a piece of real estate. That would be nearly impossible, certainly impractical to carry gold or any precious metals. And in the event that it's a case of hyperinflation, or you simply don't have any currency, you don't have to worry about confiscation of that sort of thing. You can just carry your seed phrase across borders and voila, you've still got your Bitcoin. So keep in mind, most of the people who are paying attention to this right now are probably in the West or in the United States or Canada. And aside from the Canadian trucker protests, most of these issues probably feel very far from home, but it doesn't matter if you get the value today. What matters is that value, does that value exist for enough people that it's going to win the war as the best money? And is this going to be the most important financial asset of our generation for the rest of our lives, perhaps ever? Would be, I think, the opinion that many of us Bitcoiners have. So it's worth thinking about, how does the fact that billions of people around the world find the attributes of Bitcoin as advantageous, how does that affect what you do with it? I encourage you, if you're not already, consider looking into getting some Bitcoin. Of course, I would encourage that as part of a Bitcoin newsletter, but there are tons of awesome resources out there. And I'm going to share some of those coming up soon as well, just to get people started. Appreciate you being here as always. Take care, and I'll be back with more soon.